Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar to launch the final report of our Youth Commission. I'm Fiona Aldridge, Director of Policy and Research at Learning and Work Institute, and we're really pleased that you could join us. We're delighted to welcome a fabulous lineup of contributors, and we'll also be recording the event so that we can share it on our website afterwards. Now, in theory, young people have a world of opportunity ahead of them and longer lives to enjoy it. But the reality, particularly at the moment, can feel much different, with young people facing a double whammy of their disrupted education and a tough labour market. Latest labour market stats were published this morning, and they really bring these issues into stark focus. So while the labour market looks to be stabilising, albeit at higher levels of unemployment, young people appear to have borne the brunt of the economic impact of the pandemic. Today's figures show that young people account for 3/5 of the fall in employment that we've seen since the start of the crisis, and there are now more than 500,000 18 to 24-year-olds who are unemployed. So this event is very appropriately titled to look at the challenge that we face. So how do we ensure that our young people don't become a pandemic generation faced with poorer education and employment opportunities? Now, our Youth Commission, which began before the pandemic but has continued throughout, has sought to explore these issues and to make recommendations that will ensure that young people get a fair chance in life. I'm delighted to be able to hand over shortly to Stephen Evans, the Chief Executive of Learning and Work Institute, to tell us more about the Commission and to outline its findings and recommendations. But as we hear from our speakers, I'm also keen that there's an opportunity for you to contribute. And you can do this by putting your comments and questions in the chat box, and we'll come back to these later. And we also have a number of polls that we'd like you to respond to. The first one, which is about the government's response to supporting young people, was emailed out to you when you signed up to the event. And please do respond to this if you haven't already while Stephen is speaking. So Stephen, can I invite you to give us an overview of the work of the Commission and to share the findings and recommendations of the latest and final report?
Thanks, Fiona. And yes, in addition to the ways that Fiona mentioned there, please do also tweet away for those of you on Twitter using the hashtag you can see on the screen there, LW Youth Commission. So I'm just going to run us through some of the background to the Youth Commission, some of the findings and some of the recommendations as well. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So as Fiona mentioned, we set up this commission back in the dim and distant days of 2018. And the exam question that we set ourselves was, how do we make sure that every young person in England, and the focus was on England, has a fair chance in life through education and employment? And across the next couple of years, we had a pandemic, some of you may have noticed, so that's had a pretty profound effect, and Fiona ran through some of the stats, so I'll mention a couple more. But we also did lots of research, 5 research reports in total, looking at how education and employment outcomes vary today, looking at how the system stacks up, where there are some gaps, where there are some disjoints, and then also pulling together the final report. You can see the screenshot of the cover there, which we published in December, and I'll run through some of those recommendations too. What you can see on this slide as well is that heat map of England, and this shows the results of our Youth Opportunity Index that we did before the pandemic. And we looked at, I think, 7 measures of education and employment by local authority area, and took a look at which areas young people were getting better outcomes and which they were getting less good outcomes. So the darker red on that map shows better outcomes, and the lighter red is less good outcomes. And I think what it really shows is that there's some overall stats which I'm going to run through in a moment, but there's also a real postcode lottery here. You've got talent evenly distributed across the country, but opportunity isn't. So we really need to coin a phrase to level up opportunity for every young person. Your chances in life shouldn't depend on your background, they should depend on your talents and your hard work and your efforts. So you can explore all that Youth Opportunity Index data on the website, along with all of those other reports. But I thought I'd just share a couple of the edited highlights of the findings and then the recommendations too. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So this shows a little bit about the Commission. So our work was guided by 4 commissioners whose smiling pictures you can see on your screen there. So 2 of those commissioners you're going to be hearing from today. So Kate Green, MP, the Shadow Education Secretary, who was a commissioner up until her appointment to the Shadow Cabinet last year, and Jo Mayher, the Principal and CEO of Loughborough College. And I'm grateful to both of them for their guidance, help and support through the work of the Commission, and from our other 2 commissioners as well, Amy King and Maggie Galliers. So a big thanks to all of those commissioners for guiding our work. We also had an expert advisory group, around about 20 people, I think, on that, who were invaluable. So huge thanks to them for their work and support and input during the course of the Commission. And I'm really grateful as well to our supporters and sponsors, the Association of Colleges, Prospects, NOCN, Capital City College Group and London South Bank University. Without their support, we couldn't have done any of the work of the Commission, so I'm very grateful to them for their support. So that's a little bit about the Commission, our commissioners, expert group, our sponsors, and how we worked across those 2 years or so through those different reports. So let's get on to the findings, which is the next slide, please. So I could reel off a ream of statistics, all of which would have been going sharply in the wrong direction since last March, but I'm going to try and limit myself to just a small number. So first of all, actually, the latest data out today, as Fiona highlighted, shows more than 500,000 young people are unemployed, and that's more than double what it was in March 2020. So you've had this steep increase in unemployment since the start of the pandemic, most of it concentrated at the start of the pandemic and then some flattening since then. And this is not entirely unexpected, given the effects of the economic restrictions that have been necessary have been particularly starkly felt in retail and hospitality, which are sectors young people are far more likely to be working in. So you've had this increase in unemployment, young people also more likely to be furloughed, and then many young people facing a double whammy of disrupted education and a weaker labour market. So I think it's very clear that young people have been harder hit by the economic impacts of the pandemic. And I'm particularly concerned about those roughly 50,000 or so 16 or 17-year-olds that are not in education, employment or training. And in fact, the status of half of those is recorded as unknown. You know, we don't even know what their status is. So while most 16 and 17-year-olds are in full-time education, and in fact more have stayed in full-time education through the pandemic, a very sensible response, and given that we have lower participation in education than other countries, that helps to close some of the gap. Of those who aren't in full-time education, only about a third are in work, and that has fallen sharply in the last year and sharply over the last 5 years or so. So I think there's a real challenge around those 16 to 17-year-olds who are not engaged in full-time education. And then, as I say, that big increase in the number of 16 to 24-year-olds who are unemployed since the start of the pandemic. Lots of other stuff in the Youth Commission about the quality of work, about levels of pay, about all of that sort of stuff, but I thought I'd just focus on those 2 stats for now. And then if we move on to the next slide, a couple of stats here around the education side. So 84% of 19-year-olds have a level 2 qualification and 68% have a level 3 qualification. That's improved over time, although it's flatlined somewhat in the last 5 years, but it's lower than in many other countries. So again, an important skills gap there, and it matters because we know that the bar for getting into work and getting on at work is rising. Economic change means that the skills base for finding work and for progressing at work is rising over time. So this is storing up problems if we're not careful. So lots of challenges. We've got that overall employment challenge, which has been particularly stark in the last year during the pandemic. We've got that shortfall in skills attainment compared to other countries. And then we've got that real mismatch across the country where in terms of outcomes and a real postcode lottery of opportunity. That's kind of a set of challenges. If we move on now to the next slide, we get on to the hopefully slightly cheerier bit, which is what can we do about it? And the good news is there's definitely something that we can do about this. And I think this is a good time to be having this conversation as the vaccine rollout seems to be going pretty well, and the Prime Minister announced his roadmap yesterday to trying to reopen our economy and society. So for me, the Youth Commission's recommendations and what we think about in terms of young people, we should be really ambitious to have a decade of recovery from the effects of the pandemic, but renewal in terms of doing better than we were before the pandemic too. So that focus on recovery and renewal imbues everything that we as an organisation and as a Youth Commission are saying. So we set out some ambitions for 2030 to benchmark against other countries and to see where we think we should be. And what we argued is that by 2030, we should aim for 90% of 25-year-olds to have a level 2 qualification and 3/4 to have a level 3 qualification. So this would be an acceleration after the stalling that we've had in the last few years and close the gaps of those skills levels compared to some other countries. And if we move on to the next slide, we think a commitment to full employment is really, really critical. So we've got to tackle that youth unemployment crisis by ending long-term unemployment and ending low pay. So we've got lots of initiatives at the moment. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but how do we make it stack up to that long-term ambition? What else do we need to do? And we'll be tracking progress against both of these ambitions to ensure young people have a good foundation of skills and that we aim towards full employment. We'll be tracking those ambitions and progress against them on an online dashboard, which you can access via our website as of today, and we'll see how we get on over the next 9 years or so till 2030. So those are some, fairly big and high-level ambitions. How can we achieve those? So we set out a blueprint. There are 10 groups of recommendations in the report itself, but I just want to take you through just a small number of edited highlights now of what I think are some of the biggest priorities. So if we move on to the next slide, first is about Kickstart. So I think Kickstart's a good idea. It's good that the government introduced it, but, and there's always a but, right? So firstly, it's currently due to end in terms of new referrals in December this year. But given that employment has taken 3 to 7 years to recover after the last 3 recessions, that just doesn't seem right. Surely we need to extend Kickstart for at least another year, if not longer. So I'm hoping the Chancellor will do that in his budget next week. But also, too many young people who could benefit from Kickstart are not even eligible for it. So one example would be those 16 to 17-year-olds I talked about earlier, who in general are not eligible for universal credit and so can't get near Kickstart. And we need to focus on the quality of Kickstart as well, making sure we've got training and wraparound support built into it. And I'm not quite sure that we're there yet. But I don't think Kickstart should just be a response to this recession and then we stop. I think it should be the foundation for a job guarantee that allows us to eliminate long-term unemployment for young people. So I think when young people reach, say, 12 months out of work, that we should have a job guarantee that pays them and funds from the government a job along these sorts of lines, along the Future Jobs Fund lines, and make sure no young person is long-term unemployed. So let's get this response to recession right, but then let's make a change for the longer term too. And if we just click on one, please. Second element on this side that we argued for was a new youth allowance within universal credit. At the moment, there's a real divide between the employment and skills systems. And if you're on universal credit, you're going to get help with a job search, but you're not going to have that focus on getting learning, including up to level 3. So what we argued is, given that learning and getting to hopefully towards that level 3, or certainly up to, you know, basic skills and level 2, and then hopefully onto level 3, it's so critical for young people's future employment prospects. It's so critical for our future prosperity and productivity that we need to try and find a way to combine job search with learning up to level 3. So let's do that, and let's build it into the benefit system, and let's develop new flexible forms of learning that allow young people to do that and to carry on their learning if they find a job during their course as well. And that requires new skills for work coaches as well. It requires the employment and the skill systems to work together much more than they have to date. The other point I hear is that, as I said, those 16, 17-year-olds miss out on so much support at the moment. And so if they don't stay in full-time education or find themselves a job, too often they're going to go missing in the system. So we think that youth allowance within universal credit should be open to 16 to 17-year-olds as well. And let's get all of those 16 to 24-year-olds who are not in full-time education or not in employment, let's get them looking for a job and combining that with learning up to level 3. And then if we click on one more, please. So ending low pay. So the government has actually already committed to raising the minimum wage to 2/3 of median pay, and to making that open to 21 to 24-year-olds as well. At the moment, it's older age groups. So we think that's the right thing to do. Now, ending low pay isn't enough on its own to end in-work poverty, and it's not enough in terms of good work. So there's lots of other stuff we need to do, and we do talk about that in the report. But I think the government's on the right track there. We also argued that actually we should get rid of the apprentice minimum wage rates. Our previous research for the Learning and Work Institute has shown it's really complicated, employers don't understand it, and it's driving non-compliance through lack of understanding of rules. So I think the age-related rates, for me, are the better way to go, and increase each of them substantially. So there's a point about quality of work, and there's a point about pay here as well. So that's the kind of, I'm really rattling through here. There is a 54-page report, I think, for those who want the fuller set of detail. But if we move on to the next slide, please, to more of the sort of education and learning and skills focused elements. They need to all link together, but I think it's important to make a distinction too. So we want more 16 to 17-year-olds to stay in full-time education. Rates have increased over time, and as I say, they've increased in the pandemic, which is what usually happens in recessions and is a very sensible thing. But we still have a gap compared to other countries. So we should look to increase participation further. That requires a focus on technical and vocational education, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. But also, you can't do this on the cheap. You can't have world-class learning on the cheap. And part of the reason that we have fewer taught hours on average per week for vocational courses than other countries. T-levels will narrow the gap, but they won't close it. And you need to pay for those extra hours, and you need to pay for quality hours as well, so that staff can afford it. And we've got, you know, we really invest in our teaching staff, and that we have good quality equipment as well where that's needed. So I think others have called for the funding rate for that age group to be raised to £5,000. I would completely endorse that. So more young people, more 16 to 17-year-olds in education, and let's invest in them so that we get world-class education for them too. So we click on one, please. Apprenticeship. So the number of apprenticeships for young people has gone from low before the pandemic to very low during the pandemic. And this in part is the result of the incentives that were built into the reforms to the system, including the apprenticeship levy 2 or 3 years ago. So the apprenticeship levy, I think, is a good idea. There were lots of good things in the switches to standards, for example, but it's both predictable and predicted that the changes that were made have led to this decline in apprenticeships for young people, and we need to change that. We need to change the incentives. So under the previous Labour government, there was a big focus completely correctly, in my view, on trying to make sure that 1 in 2 young people participated in higher education. I would say let's put the same effort in this next decade into trying to make sure 1 in 3 young people participate in apprenticeships. And that's everything from level 2 up to level 4 plus. So let's have a real focus on that. And to do that, we need to make some changes. And we've talked in the report about, for example, funding apprenticeships for 16 to 18-year-olds from the education budget rather than the levy, building more incentives into the levy system to encourage employers to take on young people and other things like that. But let's put our efforts behind this goal to get more apprenticeships for young people starting out in their careers. And if we just click on one, please. Just lastly on this, on higher education, there are some who seem to argue that we should have fewer young people going into higher education, though it's usually somebody else's children that shouldn't be going. I disagree with that. I think if you look at other countries, our participation in HE isn't out of kilter. What looks odd in England is this higher education is too often a one-shot chance at a 3-year full-time undergrad degree when you're age 18, and if you don't do that, that's that. So I think much greater focus on growing higher technical routes and degree apprenticeships, but that should be about increasing participation in higher education, getting more people up to level 3 and beyond level 3, rather than pushing down and having fewer people participating at level 6 plus. So I think there's a really important distinction in what the purpose of this higher technical routes and degree apprenticeships is, where there's common cause that we should do both these things, but I think different people are coming from different places in terms of who should be doing these. So if we just then click on to the next slide, please. This is the final slide, you'll be delighted to know, and just tries to summarise, I think, where we are overall. As I say, the Youth Commission published 6 reports. The final report's 54 pages. There's loads of charts, there's loads of analysis, there's loads of stuff on the website to take a look at. But effectively, it boils down to a clear ambition that every young person should have good skills and employment prospects. That's a very simple statement, but it's guided everything else that we're saying. But we know that today we're some distance off this. So we have that significant rise in unemployment during the pandemic, and we have 1/3 of 19-year-olds without level 3 qualification, higher than in other countries, and that real disparity in opportunities across England. And so to change that, we need to expand technical education, boost apprenticeships, introduce a youth allowance and job guarantee, and provide much better career support. Taken together, all of the recommendations in the report add up to £4.6 billion per year, each year for the next decade. That's a 20% increase roughly on what we were spending pre-pandemic on employment and skills for young people. So it's substantial money, although I have to say these days when the government's deficit's running at about £400 billion, £4.6 billion doesn't seem that much. But I think the point is, this is an investment. It's not just spending, it's an investment, and it would deliver returns and it will deliver a better future, not just for each of those young people who will hopefully benefit, but actually to our country and boosting growth and boosting opportunity. And that's the case, it's for fairness and prosperity. I'm going to stop there. We'll take those slides down. That hopefully gives you a flavour about the work of the Commission and where we've got to and the sort of issues that we're trying to flag up and recommendations that we're making. I'm going to move us straight on to our next speaker, who's Kate Green, MP. As I mentioned before, Kate is the Shadow Education Secretary and was a Commissioner for the Youth Commission up until her appointment to the Shadow Cabinet. So we thank her for her support during that and interested in her perspective as a Commissioner previously, but also as the Shadow Education Secretary. So Kate, I'll pass straight over to you, please, now.
Well, thank you ever so much, Stephen. And it is a real pleasure to be speaking to everyone today about the hugely important issue of youth skills and employment. And as you say, I'm particularly pleased to do so because I served as a member of the Youth Commission prior to my appointment to the Shadow Cabinet. I think even pre-pandemic, it was clear that the skills and opportunities available to young people were an issue of huge importance for individuals, obviously, for communities, and for our economy. And I have always believed passionately that every young person should have the very best chance of a great career. We can never forgive the waste of talent, the demoralisation, and the economic damage that's caused by youth unemployment. But too many people simply don't get the opportunity to make the most of their potential. So while I wasn't a commissioner by the time the final report of the Commission was agreed and published, I welcome it as a vitally important contribution to the debate on how we break the connection between the circumstances of someone's birth and their lifetime opportunities. Now, of course, the coronavirus pandemic has created new inequalities while also exacerbating old ones. It's no surprise that those on low incomes, in insecure work, and young people have faced some of the most significant disruptions in the labour market. And too often, the most disadvantaged young people also saw the greatest disruption to their education. But the reality is that these inequalities have been features of our economy and of our society since long before the pandemic, as Keir Starmer was arguing so forcefully in his speech last week, calling for a new chapter for Britain. Our labour market has for far too long been unequal, with a huge number of low qualification, low security, low wage jobs. And for the last decade, funding for further education and training has been cut by consecutive Conservative-led governments, meaning that fewer and fewer young people have access to the opportunities they need and deserve. And worse, these inequalities are a lottery, a postcode lottery. It really can't be right that where you live determines the offer that is available to you. As Keir pointed out last week, you shouldn't be forced to leave your hometown because there are no good career opportunities for you locally. And as the Commission has rightly identified, educational outcomes are more dependent on the circumstances of someone's birth in England than in almost any other country. When fully half of a young person's educational outcomes can be predicted by their parents' earnings, it's clear that we're underusing the potential of a generation of young people. And when we let that potential go to waste, everybody loses. Because this inequality isn't just a social evil, scarring individual life chances and communities. It's also economically illiterate. Lower skills and fewer opportunities contribute to the chronically low productivity, which was holding our economy back long before the pandemic began. And they threaten to continue holding it back if we don't act quickly. We're not in this situation by accident. The truth is that the policy choices of the governments of the last 10 years have contributed to this problem. Slashing funding for further education, cutting the maintenance support that students relied on, introducing a system of loans in further education that have seen money returned to the Treasury year on year, and failing to use the state as a force for economic growth, all have set back our economy. The underlying weaknesses of our economy before this pandemic are a direct result of the Conservatives' failed economic ideology. And remedying the situation will also not happen by chance or just by grand proclamations by ministers who've finally woken up to the importance of further education. It will take political will and political leadership. Keir said last week that transforming our society and our economy must be nothing less than a moral crusade for the Labour Party. As Shadow Education Secretary, I know that we can only achieve that when skills and opportunities to learn and work are available to all, regardless of their background. And that means we must be ambitious for every young person in the country. Everyone should leave education with the skills and qualifications they need to move on to the next stage of their life and work or further study. And that's why I think the ambitious targets set by the Commission are so important, because we know that increasing the number of people qualified to at least level 3 could transform their life chances, allowing them to get new and better jobs with greater security and higher wages. A society in which everyone can access these qualifications is the only way we can have an economy in which all are more prosperous. Unlocking the potential of all young people, making Britain the best place in the world to grow up, is at the core of what the Labour Party believes in and what we aim to achieve when we are next in government. It goes to the heart of our beliefs about fairness. And as we finally come out of this pandemic and begin to look towards the next election, we've got the chance to recapture the spirit of the great Labour governments of the past, working with education providers, employers, mayors, combined authorities and local leaders to equip the next generation of young workers with the skills to make the most of the new technologies that will rebuild our country for the future. It's only by creating opportunity for all that we can secure a fair and sustainable recovery from this pandemic as we move to an economy that replaces insecure, low-skill, low-wage jobs with secure, skilled, well-paying careers that are available to people because of their capabilities and not merely their background. And it's clear the government isn't doing enough. Figures published just this morning, as we've heard, have shown that it is young people who are most likely to have become unemployed in this pandemic, and those with lower qualifications are the worst affected. Despite the scale of the challenge, Kickstart, the government's flagship youth job creation scheme, has provided only 2,000 jobs since its launch more than 6 months ago. After delays, only 1 in 100 young people out of all of those eligible had started a Kickstart placement. Meanwhile, proposed cash incentives for new apprenticeships are also failing. Only a fraction of the new opportunities promised have come to fruition, while young people across the country have seen their education and earnings hugely disrupted. And that comes on top of the dramatic fall off in opportunities for young people to start apprenticeships since the apprenticeship levy was introduced. Pathways for young people at level 2 and through SMEs have largely disappeared. Vital routes of progression that get people to the starting gate for their future careers have been significantly reduced. And as the Youth Commission has shown, we must do far more to make opportunities accessible to young people and to make sure businesses are actually able to offer them as we begin to emerge from the economic damage caused both by the pandemic and the government's incompetent response to it. Labour has a plan to ensure that access to good quality apprenticeships and great careers is a priority coming out of the pandemic. We have suggested using unspent levy funds, over £300 million last year, to subsidise the wages of tens of thousands of new apprentices. Paying half of their wages over the course of a year, starting with a 100% subsidy in the first 3 months and tapering down, would save thousands of pounds for employers and meet their biggest cost at a time of great uncertainty. Tens of thousands of young people would benefit from the policy, creating opportunities in all industries and in all parts of the country, at a time when businesses face a huge challenge in creating new jobs. It's a policy designed for the challenges we face, immediate, practical, and guaranteed to create new opportunities. Because Labour knows that creating jobs and doing it now must be at the core of our economic recovery. We can't simply return to business as usual when business as usual wasn't working for millions of people. We know the task is urgent for the millions of people locked out of good jobs because of low qualification levels, or the millions more who are worried that they face the threat of unemployment in the months to come. And despite the rhetoric, the government have simply not had a response that meets either the scale or the urgency of the challenge. In June, the Prime Minister pledged an opportunity guarantee so that every young person would be offered the chance of an apprenticeship or an in-work placement. And the Secretary of State announced the Lifetime Skills Guarantee, a proposal that I have to say could have come straight out of Labour's own Lifelong Learning Commission in 2019, last October. But despite millions being on furlough or losing their jobs, none of the additional support or funding is going to be available until even April. Time is being wasted. Thousands of people could and should have already been training for new qualifications, raising their skill levels or preparing to change industry in the months since this policy was announced, but instead they're waiting month after month as they face greater insecurity and instability. And that's why our Shadow Chancellor, Annalisa Dodds, has asked again and again why the government hasn't built training opportunities into the furlough programme. It's why Labour has called on the government to implement a genuine opportunity guarantee to ensure each young person out of work for more than 6 months has access to a meaningful choice of an education placement, an apprenticeship, or employment. Because if ever it was right to use the time that people are not working to retrain and skill them for the jobs of the future, it is now. As the Youth Commission points out, ensuring young people achieve higher qualifications is vital for a higher skilled and higher wage economy. I began this speech by saying how passionate I was about securing the life chances and career prospects of young people. I started my own working life at the beginning of the 1980s. A time of appalling levels of youth unemployment. I saw how that blighted lives, how it wasted potential, how it drove inequality, how it cost our economy dearly. And most of all, I've never forgotten how it felt to be a young person at that time, worrying about getting started out in employment. That's why I'm so determined that skills, education, and opportunities for all, and especially for young people, must be at the heart of the economic recovery in the months ahead. And it will also be at the heart of a programme of a Labour government after the next election. If we want to deliver on our commitment to make Britain the best place in the world to grow up in, as Keir Starmer has said, we must give all our young people ambition and hope for their future. And that means building an education and skills system that's the envy of the world, one with world-class standards and narrowing inequality. Because it's only by achieving this that we can have the foundations for a fair, sustainable, and prosperous society and economy. That's why the work of the Youth Commission and of everyone involved in it is so important. It sets out the roadmap for a system that gives all young people a chance to succeed and supports them in their aspirations. For those young people, for their families, for their communities, and for our country, nothing could be more important. So, Stephen, let me conclude by thanking you for your work in pointing the way to how we begin to achieve that shared ambition.
Great. Thank you, Kate, so much. Thank you for those kind words at the end and for covering a lot of ground there as well. We've had some questions sort of flooding through. I can see on my app, so I'm going to put a couple of those to you. But before I do, can we put up the results of that first poll, please, which you've all been clicking away on, and let's see what the results there are. So we're asking whether the government's done enough, and I think that we regard that as a very clear result. So 80% of those of you who voted said no. So I think that's fairly clear. So I'm going to ask the team to open up the next poll if we can, which is, given what you've just said and given what Kate was talking about as well, what should we be focusing on? What should we do next? So you can see a list of options there. I'm sure there are others you'd like to be on there, and you can kind of add those into the chat if you wish. And you probably want to do multiple of these, so you can pick up to 3. So if you can please get voting around that, and then we'll kind of bring the result of that poll through towards the end. Kate, one of the things you talked about was apprenticeships, and there's a kind of what do you do in a pandemic thing about, you know, when employers aren't hiring, and I think you talked a little bit about proposals for incentives around that. I'm kind of interested as well about what your view is about how we can, once we hopefully get through this pandemic, how we can increase apprenticeships for young people, given they were pretty low to start with. And my view is that some of the changes that were made a couple of years ago actually reduced those opportunities as well. So how do we make apprenticeships a much bigger option for more young people?
Yeah, let me just highlight a few things, because I think we can all agree that apprenticeships are a gold standard route for young people into a great career, and we ought to be doing everything we can to support them and to support young people in taking the steps into and through apprenticeships and into a really good future. And so I think the first thing I'd say, Stephen, is we have to think about pathways into apprenticeships and the careers that they lead to. And I think those pathways are very disjointed at the moment. Partly they're disjointed because departments and government don't connect well together. So you've got programs being put out by the DWP. Kickstart's a really good example, with no obvious route through into the apprenticeship route that could smoothly follow and, you know, could build on the Kickstart experience. And I think that thinking about those pathways and progression routes for young people in a very systematic way, with apprenticeships as the sort of key element of developing that on-the-job, high-skill, high-qualification expertise, is the first thing that we need to attend to. And we need to do that as much as anything by joining up government. Secondly, I think there's no doubt that the levy system, and you alluded to this in your opening remarks, really hasn't worked for employers. Particularly, it hasn't worked for small employers, and it hasn't worked in terms of so much of it going unspent. I mean, it's really unforgivable, I think, that more than £300 million of money that was meant to be spent on skilling up our young people was actually just returned to the Treasury last year and disappeared off into their bank account. I think we need to look at ways of protecting and ensuring that money gets spent in the way that it was intended to. And that might mean thinking about how it could be deployed more flexibly, perhaps at local level. And that leads me to the third thing I really want to say, which I think is very much missing from the government's strategies. Indeed, they make a virtue of kind of missing it, which is this reluctance to devolve so much of the skills landscape, the budgets and the decision making to regional or sub-regional level, where it could be made, where that could be done much more effectively. So if I think about Greater Manchester, where I'm an MP, you know, we've got an industrial strategy, we've got an equalities strategy, we've got travel and transport strategies, we've got health and wellbeing strategies, but we don't have, Andy Burnham and the Combined Authority don't have the ability to combine all those strategies with the full range of skills and education and strategies and funding that I think would enable us to make the most of apprenticeships and other skills and training routes for our young people. And I think the government's resolute determination to centralise everything through the skills white paper that was announced early this year is really, really regrettable, really missing the opportunity that devolution presents to align our ambitions for training and for apprenticeships with our industrial and regeneration strategies. And you know, we're waiting to see the government bring forward some legislation and following off the back of its skills white paper. And I really hope this is a debate that we can properly engage in with ministers, because I think they've just got this wrong and I think they're missing an opportunity.
And I guess one more question which kind of seamlessly links on from that, which is I guess two parts to it which have come through. So I was going to ask you about that join up point. I mean, for example, in the FE white paper, there is not a single mention, even in the glossary, I don't think, of Kickstart or Restart, which or youth unemployment, which kind of seems like a slightly missing element. So is your and also kind of governments eventually get a bit annoyed that they announce things and then they can't, they think, well, why is the delivery not quite what we hoped it would be? And for example, I think on the expansion of traineeships announced last July. I think it was only a few weeks ago the DfE decided which providers to give that extra cash to. I'm not sure any young person's managed to start one yet. So is your view that actually you talked a lot about devolution being a chance to join some of these things up? Is that kind of how you get that delivery on the ground and that join up, rather than trying to do these things at central government level? And second part to that question, which has come through on a couple of people asking in the Q&A about how we, you talked about pathways, for example, on apprenticeships, how we get proper careers advice and information and guidance for young people themselves to make the right decisions. So I guess two sort of separate but related points there.
Yeah, both really excellent questions. I think you need both national and regional elements of a successful strategy. I think the role of national government is to make sure that incentives reinforce one another, they don't work against each other. And we've got a system now where they do work against one another. So, for example, why would you take on an apprentice at the moment where the subsidy you receive will be less and the investment that you will have to make will be more than if you take on a Kickstart starter for the first 6 months? You might then translate them into an apprentice, but you've had the first 6 months at a much cheaper deal if you're the employer. And it seems to me that thinking about consistency and systemizing your incentives is something that national government joining up effectively has to do and is failing to do at the moment. But I think you're right to say that when you want to deliver effectively, when you're looking at the industrial sectors where the opportunities arise, when you're looking at the kind of population that you're serving, the geographic dispersal of that population across your region, when you're looking at huge differences in employment opportunities in different parts of the country. The nature of the labour market in Cornwall is very different from the labour market in Greater Manchester, where I'm an MP. I think you can only really design meaningful delivery programmes at that regional, sub-regional level. I just don't think a one-size-fits-all national model works effectively. And I think, we see that very, very clearly when we look around the country. I really like the question about careers advice and guidance, because I do think this is crucially important for young people whose route could be through the vocational technical skills and training into careers that are jobs we desperately will need done in the economy of the future, the service jobs, the STEM jobs, the manufacturing and making things jobs, where our country woefully underperforms and where we really want to be a high performing economy. And so that information, advice and guidance isn't just about what happens as those young people are thinking about their careers. It's about when they're thinking about their study choices. And we know that in schools, despite improvements that have been made in schools careers guidance, the Gatsby standards, finally a recognition by the government having stripped back schools careers advice 10 years ago, that it is important. I think we still need to do more to ensure that careers advice and the people who provide it have an equal grasp of the vocational and technical routes that they do of the academic route, the A-level and the university route. That after all, let's face it, most of the people teaching in our schools also went through, and somebody put this really, really tellingly to me the other day. They said, everyone can describe the study route you need to follow to become a doctor. You don't have to be a doctor to know that, you do your A-levels, you make sure you've got some sciences and maths, and then you go on to university, you become a doctor. Very few of us can describe the study route for becoming a bricklayer or an electrical engineer or working as a senior manager in the care sector. And we need to be able to do that in our schools, in our colleges, so that young people are not having their career choices and the careers advice they receive influenced by the experience only of the people who are providing it. And I think, too, of course, it's really important that we think about the role of employers in the provision of careers advice and guidance. Now, employers rightly are more concerned about their skills needs right now, and they might be thinking a bit about their skills needs in the future than the skills needs of the whole of the economy in their region or how it might change in the future. But they have a very, very crucial role, I think, not least in providing the work experience opportunities, the meaningful work experience opportunities that actually give young people the practical experience that sits alongside good quality careers advice. Because I know from what I've seen in my own constituency, that it is that work experience that often switches something on for a young person, says, yeah, now I get this, and I know this is what I want to do with my life. And so I think we've got, along with all the other things we want to talk to employers about, what kind of education and training and skills are important to them, how do we fund that, what role do they see for themselves in helping to design it. I think we really do need a very, very constructive and purposeful discussion with employers about the provision of work experience. T-levels are meant to do that. Obviously, it's proving very, very difficult in the middle of the pandemic to get that work experience element off the ground. And I think the jury is out on whether T-levels are going to deliver it effectively. But I think it is a really crucial element of the way in which young people make study choices and careers choices, and important that we're very, very systematic about what we're doing with work experience.
Great, thanks, Kate. I think that's really important. It shines out of so much of the research that we've done elsewhere as well. There's loads more questions kind of flowing through. What I'm going to do is make that Fiona's problem to try and manage. So I'm going to pass across to Fiona to chair the Q&A. I know, Kate, you're able to stay with us as part of that until about 2 o'clock, and I know you have to go to another meeting, but I'm keen to bring our other panelists in as well. So Fiona, I'll pass across to you at this point.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for a really stimulating discussion. I'd like to invite the other members of our panel to join us now and to switch on their cameras. I'm going to invite Jo Marr, who's Principal and Chief Executive of Loughborough College and one of the commissioners, to join us, and also to Marianne Matthews from EY Foundation. Just first of all, I wondered if both of you, Jo to start, could just give us a few minutes sort of outlining your thoughts on this, and then we'll come to some of the many questions in the chat. And please, if you're watching, please do add in some more questions. I'm sure we'll get a chance to go through them. Jo.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona, and many thanks, Stephen, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be part of the Youth Commission, and I echo so much of what both Kate and Stephen had said around, this notion that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity isn't. And I think that, for me, is the reason d'etre that this commission existed. And having lived and worked in 4 different regions across England and been involved with 3 different LEPs, for me, I think that's brought really to home the unique challenges that the local level you face. So when I was working in Lincolnshire, we had coastal and rural deprivation factors compounded by travel to work issues. To get to the nearest city, if you're on public transport, that could be an hour and a half. So, and then you were saturated by micro SMEs. So that creates a volume issue as a training provider, that creates a funding issue to get to those economies of scale that you want to deliver. So without having local flexibility, that can compound those opportunities that you can create and put on as a provider for young people. Thinking about when I was working in Cheshire in a real land-based and agricultural setting, that we were trying to stimulate horticulture and agriculture and to get farming growing across the UK. There were supply chain challenges, complications with EU and delivery, and for young people there, they were having to travel and live in accommodation 100% of the time to access their learning, because they couldn't access that learning in a local setting. Moving into some of the efficiencies I think we can create within the system, we've touched a lot on Kickstart. And if we look at it, Kickstart's a £2 billion programme. Marcus Rashford got nearly 400 million for free school meals. Further education only achieved 400 million in 10 years as a funding uplift. So the funding for further and technical education, when we're seeing the kind of sums in other initiatives, we can't reboot technical education without sustainable long-term funding settlement that values vocational and technical and supports people in apprenticeships. Because remember, whether you're an independent training provider or a college, you are there to serve young people and adults and to promote social mobility and their futures. We can only do that with the ability to put on the courses that they need, that are supported and backed by employers, with the right funding to do it. So this postcode lottery that exists is compounded by some of the travel to learn fluctuations that we're seeing. And when we think about T-levels, you can only run a T-level with access to that specific placement for that specific subject. So if you're in a rural college and those employers aren't on your doorstep, that doesn't mean that that college can't serve the talent that is equally distributed. It means it doesn't have the mechanism to be able to create that placement opportunity for that young person. But that young person could be socially mobile in future and want to go and work in a city, so they should still be able to access it. So for me, my biggest reflection from the Youth Commission was around how to create equity. We've got to have local flexibility to support the employer network that is on our doorstep, to create equal opportunities for young people, that's got a sustainable funding settlement that will drive fantastic things. Kickstart, if it works, will be brilliant. Training providers have got to be more involved. We've got to get government departments talking to each other, so DWP and DFE having shared KPIs and shared agendas around this space, because the money's there. That's 2.4 billion that was distributed, that actually, the technical education and college sector, even half of that, you would have seen one-to-one mentoring and psychological support for people with barriers to addiction moving back into employment and youth opportunities. So I absolutely believe that the recommendations in the report are right. We should expand technical education. We should extend Kickstart and broaden it out for training. A youth allowance is critical. Apprenticeships are right for lots of young people, but they've got to have the mechanisms to fund. And career support is a really, really strong place to start. Thanks very much.
That's great, Jo, thanks. And Marianne, can I bring you in? I know EY Foundation are investing in employability programmes for young people. At Learning and Work Institute, we're delighted to be evaluating some of that and what's happened during the pandemic as they've gone online. But I wondered if you could talk to us about, from your perspective, what you think some of the major challenges are and how we address them.
Yeah, thank you, Mintra. And it's very nice to be part of the panel, and congratulations to the Learning and Work Institute, a really, really good report. And in many ways, I agree with what Jo and Kate and Stephen have already said. So let me be brief. From our perspective, we work both sides of the labour market. So pre-pandemic, our aim has always been to support young people living in poverty to get into jobs, to get into career pathways that they want to do. And to do that, rather than simply keep pushing young people to upskill, we work with employers. So we worked with 300 plus employers every year. And our aim is to help them to see our young people as talent, as future employees. And so that sort of shared mutual benefit model on both sides of the labour market is really important. And I think I'd absolutely subscribe to what Kate was saying around the need to work collaboratively with employers. I mean, our focus has been on poverty. All young people in our programmes are on free school meals. What we've seen from the pandemic is, although we've gone online with our own services, it's, I think, really just exacerbated the situation for young people who are already at the back of the queue. And actually, and we haven't talked today about race, but 80% of our young people are Black, Asian, or from other ethnic minorities. They face additional challenges in the labour market. And I think at the moment they will find themselves, notwithstanding how much potential they have and how much talent they have, they will find themselves even further back in the queue. So I think it is about equality of opportunity, but I think we have to recognise that for some young people, they need even more than that if they're really going to be able to have futures and futures they want for themselves. I think the things I would pull out from your report, I think incredibly important that we work with employers, but we also make it, I agree, Kate, that it is a regional point of view, and that's very powerful. And we do work with a lot of different regions. But I also think it's a sectoral point of view. We work a lot with tech, with retail banking, for example, and they have different requirements for entry-level jobs. And in a sense, one size doesn't fit all, either regionally or by sector. And I think having a more bespoke and sort of a more intelligent way of approaching employers and shaping what they need so that we can bring young people into those employers is going to be even more important now. I know, Fiona, you mentioned online, and I think the online proposition for young people and learning online, and we've been delivering all our employability skills online for the last year coming up to, and that's actually been very good. We didn't expect it to be, but actually in terms of developing employability skills and confidence, many young people have found it easier to go through online means. But I think what's interesting is we found more employers willing to engage than ever before. And actually, in many ways, running a lot of services online models workplaces of the future. So it's a very powerful way of getting young people to feel comfortable in those kinds of environments. And we'll be launching our findings on that with LWI later in the year. I think in terms of recommendations, I particularly would want to support, we are a Kickstart provider. We're working with a recruitment agency, Prospectus. We're providing that wraparound support, and we think Kickstart is really good for young people, but it does have to be connected to the apprenticeship pathway. Otherwise, we just fail young people and we fail them again. They need an on-ramp from Kickstart onto good apprenticeship pathways. And I think that point of having a job guarantee, but expanding it is really important. And then finally, I think I'd say that in terms of foundation skills, I think what's missing in the curriculum is anything really about softer skill development. Our programs are about how you work in teams, how you develop your own self-confidence, how you, in a sense, develop your own networks, and how you approach work situations. And I think so much more of that needs to come through the national curriculum, but also in additional things that we do with young people around apprenticeships and around preparing them for work. I feel, I'm glad that, Stephen, you ended with sort of positive prognosis. I think there is a lot of good stuff to do. And I think in many ways, what the pandemic's done is it's shown just how much the ravages of poverty over many years and austerity has really underpowered and left behind so many communities and so many of our young people. And I think, you know, now is the time, and I completely agree, Kate, now is the time for a strategy that looks beyond. But actually there's a moment in time that we can take advantage of this really difficult situation, and in a sense, not just go back to as we were a few years ago, but actually jump ahead and actually make the UK a place where there is competitiveness and that we can compete because we've got the right workforce. And actually, let's be honest, our young people are our future. So we really need to take care of them and value them in that way.
Thank you, Marianne. That's really, really helpful. And please do continue to add your questions in. One of the things I really like about the Youth Commission is that it has this greater aspiration for young people. It's not just about getting us back to where we are or just evening up, but it has a broader aspiration for all young people, thinking about the challenges that we currently have within the system about levels of achievement and levels of employment for young people. This report seeks to take us further. And yet, in the context of the pandemic, some of those challenges have become even harder. So greater aspirations, but harder challenges. What's the main thing that you think we need to do as we come out of this pandemic to ensure that we do even up that opportunity and achieve that greater ambition? Kate, recognise you have to go in a minute. I wondered if you wanted to have one last thought on that before we go to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it is about making sure we have the right priorities. And I do think that investing in young people has to be that priority. It's been really remarkable, I think, how they've been quite overlooked in this pandemic, you know, and how hostile in many ways things that have happened in the education and skills system and in the labour market have been to young people. You know, the exams debacle last summer, the amount of time they've had to spend out of learning, the fact that entry-level jobs and on-the-job learning opportunities have been sort of reduced by the pandemic. So I think that we've got to flip that on its head and say they are going to be our number one priority for coming out of the pandemic, and make sure that we're very specifically designing and delivering policies that are tailored to giving them the best start in life. And I really am sorry, Fiona, I can't stay for the rest of this session, because I think we're getting some really, really interesting thoughts and ideas coming. And I hope later on somebody will tell me what the result of the poll is, because I'm very interested in that as well. But just thank you very much for inviting me. And thanks again to everybody who has been involved in producing this fabulous report, because I think that gives us that kind of really, really laser-like focus on what we need to do very specifically for young people to give them the best training and employment chances.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you for your contribution to the Commission and for today. We will make sure that we share the findings of those polls with you, so thank you. Can I come on to the rest of the panel? So what would be, as Stephen mentioned, there's lots of recommendations here, it's a really good evidence base, would really encourage people to read it. Stephen, if I come to you, what's the one thing that you would want people to take away if we think about achieving that greater aspiration and ensuring that opportunities are more equally distributed?
Well, I find it very difficult to get down to 10 in putting together the report. So this is a particularly tough question now. I guess what I would say is the youth guarantee idea, or opportunity guarantee, I don't really care what anyone calls it, that every single young person should have an offer of a job, apprenticeship or training place, because that then gives you a mechanism to do all of that joining up, to do that investment, and to go and proactively find the young people who are going to miss out unless we do it, and to try and make sure that the support that you're offered depends on what will benefit you most, not which bit of the system you happen to turn up in. So I think that guarantee is the thing that drives lots of other bits of support and gets to that point that Kate was talking about just a moment ago.
That's great, thank you. And Joe, you've got a role as a college leader, you've got experience across a range of colleges. What do you see as the kind of main challenge in achieving this? What do you think the solution is? And have you seen it work well somewhere that you could share with us?
Yeah, so I agree with Stephen around how we've got to think about that like youth opportunity and that entitlement. But I actually would say we need to start a layer beneath that. So as a college principal and leader, it's that foundation of skills. So we get a percentage of young people, and in some colleges that can be high as nearly 50% of young people entering at 16 without their GCSE English and maths, and thinking about how we can re-engage them in that space, whether that's through functional skills, whether that's through a smaller stepping stone qualification to build the skills up. And where we're thinking about those basic skills, there is a wealth of data to suggest that is holding back young people's earning potential over the course of their lifetime. So I think we've got to focus on the foundation of their skills. And I think in some regions, colleges are so good at doing that. And you look at their pass rates for students that come in and try their level 2 for the first time with that provider, as well as their resits. And some students in colleges, they get to learn in a very different way. And there's a map into the vocational area, and it's switching that light bulb back on around the thing a young person's interested in. And we know there are secondary schools out there that are doing bite-sized vocational qualifications to help do that. And we used to have, across the whole country, these taster events and Wednesday mornings and opportunities at 14 to 16 to enable young people to step into college life. And I think there's some fantastic examples of those programs working well. So I think that for some young people, the structure around GCSEs is the thing that's holding them back. And we've got to put more flexibility in the system to get that light bulb to turn on at 14 and 15 and not wait till 16, because they're already losing out on that earning potential. And the size of the study programme at 16 they need to go on, if they're doing their English and maths at the same time, one or the other, sometimes both, that's impacting the amount of time available to get access to work placement. Many of these young people have got caring responsibilities and outside of education responsibilities. So for me, being able to take students on a journey from 14 so that we're reducing that volume at 16, and then at 16, we're specialising much more on level 3 attainment and work-based skills.
Great, thank you. And Marianne, we've recently seen a white paper published that has employers very much at the centre and thinking about more engagement with providers and employers. What would you say is the role that employers have to play in this? And again, have you got any great examples of what employers are doing that we could do more of to help achieve these aspirations?
Yeah, I think, for me, employers are key. Education, I used to be a teacher. Education isn't just about getting ready for work. I think it's so much more than that. And I think, in a way, the pandemic's shown us how difficult just living life can be. So I think the more we can help young people to build skills of resilience and all those other things, alongside everything actually that Joe just said, I completely agree with, is key. I do think employers have a role whilst young people are still in school or college, and I think, I know the CEC has made some good progress on that, but I think it's quite hard. My experience with employers is they find it quite hard to have a sustained interface with their local education providers, schools, because it isn't the school's business in the sense who's being very driven by targets and so forth to necessarily work alongside employers. So there's something about that relationship, that dynamic, that I think needs to be made easier on both sides. And I don't think that's an easy thing, but I think if we see employers in local communities and in regions as a really important member of civil society, and that they, in a sense, have a responsibility alongside charities, alongside education, alongside parents and others to come together to make things better for young people. I think, in a sense, it needs to be a shared ownership. I think post-18, I'm agreeing very much with Stephen. I think the mechanisms which are available need to be thought through better through the lens of employers, so that they're incentivised to engage with young people and engage with them for longer. But I think the sector thing is key. We are doing some work at the moment with the Chartered Banking Institute, and that's looking at the kind of entry-level qualifications that we would support our young people to get ready for, to enter into careers in retail banking. We've also done the same with the security sector and with the tech sector, and each of those, they have different requirements, they have different industry practices. And actually, you know, if we pair young people, we work with employers to make those bespoke entry points into entry-level pathways, then we're doing our very best for young people. I think at a policy level, I'm just going to jump in and say, I feel that if you go back in public policy terms, there was, you know, probably 2 decades plus ago now, a lot of public policy around older people, which I think was brilliant and served a really powerful purpose in the policy that it produced. I think we need that for young people. I think we need a decade, that this is a decade for young people in the UK, and that we have a minister for young people, and that we put a young person and their needs at the front and centre of public policy by having someone around the cabinet table who has that responsibility. And then I think it becomes easier then, because it almost authorises us all to see young people as the future and as really important. And, you know, that can then be woven into policies which incentivise employers, but also support schools and colleges to do the work they want to do with young people.
That's great. Thank you, Marianne. A great suggestion. I wondered if I could bring the panel to the previous topic that we've talked about, which is around apprenticeships. And one of the things that we've seen since the introduction of the levy and employers making decisions about how they spend that is we've seen a move towards those funds being spent on older staff and on existing staff, and actually there have been fewer opportunities for young people and fewer opportunities at lower levels. So I guess the first question about, is it a priority that apprenticeships are for young people, and of course that would be at the expense of others, and how do we get, if they are a priority, how do we make that a reality? Jo, can I come to you first?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'm hugely passionate that apprentices, you know, we want equality across all of society, you know, and I don't want to disadvantage a 40-year-old adult in the workplace who, you know, has got a family to look after from getting the very best skills for their future progression. However, in my opinion, if the adult education budget was appropriately funded, which it's been frozen and cut by about a third over the last 10 years, if the adult education budget was funded, that gives that adult the flexibility to learn around their lifestyle and doesn't actually take them off the shop floor of the employer, because as you know, 20% off the job training is the requirement of an apprentice. So for some adults, that's really challenging, because for the employer, they're having to lose a staff member for a day. So for young people, training on the job, working with an apprentice, building the skills, they are the most appropriate thing. I definitely think there needs to be a proportionality of spend that is weighted much stronger towards young people. And I totally understand, if I was a large private sector business paying a levy, I would want flexibility on what I was spending my levy on. And that's why I don't think it should be a blanket, it's only for young people, because employers, you know, are spending a lot of money in that levy. But I absolutely think there should be a weighting and a proportionality of, you know, at least 60% of that budget is ring-fenced for young people as a minimum, because it's absolutely appropriate for them. And Stephen hit on a really perfect point earlier for me. It's not a spend, it's an investment. So if we see the apprenticeship levy as an investment in the future of society and in business, then of course you'd spend your money on someone younger, because they're going to work for longer.
Thank you. And Marianne, how about your point of view from an employer perspective? What do we need to do with the apprenticeship programme, if it is the right vehicle, to encourage more opportunities for those young people?
I mean, I think if going along that point of investment, you know, if we invest in older workers who've got skills and knowledge, and we share that skills and knowledge through bringing more young people on, I think it benefits both age groups, but it actually grows UK business with the talent it needs to grow and for us to be a competitive economy. I think the challenge that we find with young people in trying to get into apprenticeship pathways, even though it looks on paper like they should be able to get onto them, they're not necessarily that brilliantly equipped from an employer perspective. And I think more work is needed, and actually more flexibility with the levy is needed to get young people apprenticeship ready. And I think doing some of that would also mean working with employers, because, you know, employers isn't their day job to think about young people necessarily, but if they think about them as future talent, they are engaged to give young people experiences, paid work experiences, and think about what young people will need in entering their businesses to be successful and stay, that actually benefits not just the young person, but the employer, because it lowers attrition. if you'll put the effort in, if you know that that young person will stay rather than if they'll leave after 6 months, which in some sectors has, attrition is a really big issue. So I think there's something about bringing, for me, it's back to the labour market. It's about bringing both sides together and making it work for both. And I think employers know they need new talent. There are lots of sectors where they need young people, but it's not always easy to attract them in, because I think for young people, and often their parents and carers, the shape of the labour market is opaque, and even more so now. So something about enabling them to know what employers need, but also employers needing to understand what young people need to be successful in their organisations.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And as Kate talked about before she left, about pathways into apprenticeships and pathways on as well, and each of those important. Can I just remind you, if you're listening, to complete the poll, and we'll come to that later. But Stephen, you picked up this point earlier, that there's a plethora of opportunities out there, and that's what we're trying to capture in our poll. You made the point that actually the lack of connection between all of them, and perhaps the confusion that both young people, their parents, employers face in selecting which one of them is best for them, is a real challenge. What did the Youth Commission have to say about advice and guidance, and about making those pathways clear?
Yeah, and somebody asked in the Q&A as well about why traineeships wasn't on the list for the poll, which, and they're meant to be in part about that preparation for apprenticeships. I think, to be honest, we probably ran out of space because of the list of options could be almost infinite, which is kind of the point. But also they are it's relatively small numbers, if we're honest. Now, maybe it'd be better if we kind of built them up and sort of built that pathway. But I think there is a point there. I think the sort of there's a point of principle here, which is I think people make better decisions than governments from the centre trying to micromanage people's lives in general. So I don't think, for example, it's particularly helpful for the Department for Education to decide exactly what types of courses people can do, because it doesn't reflect their local areas, doesn't reflect their own lives. And the dynamics, an economy is not like a splodge of economies are made up of millions of individual decisions by employers and individuals every day, and you can't anticipate all those, and the volumes are huge. So I think empowering people is principle one, and that applies more widely. Actually, you may have spotted the point I was making about the lifetime skills guarantee there. So empower people. So how do we do that? So one is we've got to have really good labour market information where it exists. We can't pretend it's more than it is. So we don't know that we're going to need like 20 more plumbers embarking or something. You can't get down to that sort of level. But the general trends in the labour market and the general skills that are in demand and where those can lead you to, we can disseminate information on that. And careers advice shouldn't be something that just happens at school. If it does happen at school, it should be something that you get access to throughout your working life, I think. And then we did argue as well in the report for a couple of things related to that. So one is that every young person should be entitled to a learning account. So this is on top of their entitlements to free learning up to particular levels, and would give them, say, £5,000 in a ring-fenced account to spend on accredited learning, giving them the choice and the flexibility, and also cutting across the sort of what I've described before as riddle me this eligibility criteria that no one quite understands, or people make a living out of understanding. So the learning account, the information and advice, proper labour market information. But also, one thing I haven't mentioned is about a transition fund. So we argued there should be a transition fund that young people can access via the career service or a college or a job centre or something, if they're looking to move career or they're looking to move area, if they want to do that. Because those extra costs of doing that, it's those who come from the poorest backgrounds who have the least, who are least able to afford it or least able to take the risk. So let's take some of that risk away and give that opportunity to people. So I think there's a number of elements that come together, and they're all underpinned by that youth guarantee, but all driven by that principle that if you give people the right information, give people access to advice, give them the tools that they need, that they will make the right decision for them.
Thank you. And I'm conscious for Joe and Stephen in particular, that the Youth Commission very much started before the pandemic, and this was an issue previously, and I guess what we've seen as a result of the pandemic is those inequalities have been exacerbated, and as we see in the labour market stats, that young people, particularly those with the least well qualified and living in disadvantaged areas, are more heavily hit. And so, I mean, we have to think about educational employment interventions, but there's wider things too, aren't there, as people deal with, mental health crisis, thinking about the kind of broader context in which they live. I guess I'm interested from all of you about what you've taken away from the pandemic and what we need to do to ensure that, to coin a phrase, that we build back better, but what do we learn from now that will help us really future-proof policy and practice? And I'd like to ask each of you. So can I start with you, Jo, please?
Yeah, and for me, I think the pandemic has widened gaps that already existed. I think it's crystal clear that we started the Youth Commission through the Learning Work Institute's brilliant team in 2018 to examine and explore the detail. And I think what's unique about LWI, I must say, is the academic balance of the researchers, but with a unique understanding of education. And that's a really hard skills mix to get, which is why I think the quality of the reports is so good. But I think for me, it's about using data-informed, evidence-based decision-making. And all of these reports are underpinned by widely known data that's there. And it's then how we're using that data and distilling it thematically to be able to advise policy and government departments to say, we understand that when you make a policy, it's got to be the broadest possible scope. But underneath that, as Stephen's touched on, we've got to go back to those local decisions. And the thing that worries me most about recovery from COVID is so many apprentices that got let go. And I say let go on purpose because they didn't go through a redundancy process. So they fell through the cracks being able to access some of the provider relief funds. They fell through the cracks being able to be just moved on to a different provider. So there's a generation of lost learning there that colleges have tried to work so hard. Like, we've got a list and we've gone through line by line. What can we offer that young person? Is it careers advice? Is it a different course? Can we find them a new employer? But that's been incredibly difficult. And there are some students that have just disengaged. So the pandemic for me brings home the challenge that we're going to have a generation potentially somewhere between 17 and 21 that could fall through the cracks of education. We've got to look at that. The inequality acts that have existed at a societal level are being compounded by, vaccine uptake. It really worries me in an area like Leicestershire. And as you know, Fiona, we've had ridiculously high COVID rates throughout the whole of the pandemic. We've never been out of lockdown, but the community that we serve has got a high proportion of BAME residents. And some of those residents are not taking up the vaccine. And we need to ensure that that we provide the best information, advice and guidance tailored to those people to try and remove those barriers, because we don't want to, have another layer of societal barriers related to, is someone vaccinated in the future or not, or will they adopt face coverings or masks or not. So for me, the cracks that are widening is the gap of those people that were let go through apprenticeships that we need to re-engage. We've got a much bigger re-engagement challenge on our hands. The gaps in terms of promoting equity around vaccinations and information that is tailored. And it does go back to this knowing your local area. And a final point I'd say is we talked a lot today about careers advice. And for me, one of the things I learned in Lincolnshire is that the last time our careers advisors had been in the workplace and in the economy was when they had the job before they had the job that they were in now. So we actually did a scheme of work where we got 5 or 6 big businesses across the region, and we took careers advisors with students to go into the factories, to get into the fields, to have a look at what's going on, to understand the jobs that are available. So we need to not lose sight of, to enable some of the barriers for young people to be removed, we've got to improve the quality of the training for our staff. And as a result of that, improve the pay for some of the staff to attract the talent to the sector. We're asking our professionals to be qualified teachers and understand industry and be technical specialists. That's a unique set of challenges. And on the current funding rates, it makes it hard to bring the talent in that's going to inspire that next generation to move forward.
Thanks, Jo. It's a really important point. And Marianne, what have you learned from the pandemic, and how do we use that to future-proof policy and practice for young people? Oh, you're on mute.
I've clearly not learned to unmute. That's the first thing I've learned from the pandemic, unbelievably, isn't it? But on a serious note, I mean, I don't think I want to repeat anything Jo said, because I think she's just said it brilliantly. I think what I would add is that we can't employ all the young people who will need futures. The only people who can are employers. I know it's obvious, but somehow there's a big missing for me in a lot of public policy. It's sort of is jobs over there, and then we support young people, and it feels like it places so much on the shoulders of young people. It feels to me it needs to be more of a shared endeavour. So for me, the big learning is we know that there are some good governance mechanisms which I think, as Stephen was saying, can be improved, like the apprenticeship levy, the youth guarantee, and so forth, and Kickstart. But actually working, in a much more joined up way continually with local, regional, national employers is really important now. And I don't think focusing simply on young people and that side of the labour market is sufficient, because I hate to say this, but it almost sets them up to fail again. We absolutely need to look at the labour market as a whole and see this as an issue around UK competitiveness and find ways to engage employers so that they can connect their opportunities, which in many sectors are thriving, with young people who deserve to get them. And I think that to me is the key, and that can be online, it can be through all different measures. But I think there's something, it's almost like one of your principles, Stephen. I think employers must be part of this going forward in a way that means it meets their needs, but also my experience of employers during pandemic has been, they have been unbelievably positive about engaging, mentoring, supporting young people in our programs, and that I think makes me feel very optimistic for the future, as long as we engage them in this piece of work we've been discussing.
No, that's great, and it's good to end on that optimistic note. Stephen, before I ask you for your final comments, and I know you'll be closing the event, I wonder if, Mintra, we could see the results of the poll to see what the audience think we need to prioritise as we tackle this issue. So we asked you to choose up to 3. Job guarantee for long-term unemployed young people and boosting apprenticeships were top of your choices, but with youth allowance 2 there. But actually, there are no doubt many of you think we should have this kind of package of options for people. Mitch, if you just want to scroll up to the bottom just to see what we don't think should be a priority. Then abolishing GCSEs right there at the bottom, and T-levels, which of course are very new. So thank you for contributing to that, everyone. Stephen, if I could hand over to you for your final thoughts on that question and any final comments.
Thanks, Fiona. And I was going to try and end on an air of optimism as well. I feel like I started with the graphs of doom with all the numbers going in the wrong direction, but I think we should finish with the green shoots of optimism. And actually, part of the optimism is that whilst youth unemployment has really risen sharply, it could have been a lot worse, which kind of sounds like the faintest of optimisms, doesn't it, really? But actually, given the drop in economic output, things could have been a lot worse. And actually, more young people staying in education is a good thing in this labour market, and a good thing full stop, given our staying on rates are lower than many other countries. So there are some things that have kind of improved, or at least not got as bad as they might have done. But I think beyond that, I think the second half of the year looks really different to the last year, and that's because of the success of the development and the rollout of vaccinations, of vaccines. I don't know if everybody else has marked pub opening date in their diary. I can see some nods there. It does feel like as we move into the later part of the summer and early autumn, we could have quite a sort of mini boom. I don't think it's going to last unless we sort of improve our economy full stop, but we will have that mini boom, and that will create new employment opportunities, and it will bring back some old ones as well. And as we shift, it feels like we're not all going to be staying on Zoom for forever. There will be some degree of return to offices for those who've been working at home, but there will be some more remote working full stop, because we worked out that in general it works. So none of us have remembered to unmute. That's not a unique point. But that will that's presented as a threat to city centres because there'll be fewer commuters coming in. Actually, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for high streets and city centres to reinvent themselves, and it's an opportunity for new businesses to support those remote workers, for example. So there will be loads of new opportunities, even in the first lockdown, what we must now call the first lockdown. Who'd have thought that at the time? Roughly, I think 1.5 million people either started work or changed jobs. So there was a real crushing of employment opportunities, but actually 1.5 million people started work or changed jobs. So there are opportunities coming up all the time, but we need to link young people into them. And that's the kind of the point, really, I guess. I guess my final note of optimism, so we've got, things could have been worse. Opportunities were opening up and will open up over the summer. The third note of optimism is that actually we're now having a conversation about where to invest rather than what to cut, which is where we've been for much of the last decade. So Joe mentioned some of the investments going on, for example, and I still think there should be more. And we've argued for some of that in the report. And my goodness me, they need to be better aligned and joined up so that we get value for money for them, for the taxpayer and for young people. But it's a better place to be talking about where to invest rather than what to cut. And then my final note of optimism is that we know we can do this. So the ambitions we've set out in the report, they're not just plucked from the air, they're looking at other countries and seeing what they've achieved. We published a report of international case studies to show how some of these sorts of ideas have been delivered in practice. We did polling and focus groups with young people to test out some of these ideas, because I fear that I and others involved in the project no longer fall into that category. But I won't ask anyone to comment on that, and we won't be opening a poll on it. So we know we can do this. We've got a choice, a debate about where to invest rather than what to cut. And there are going to be opportunities opening up, but we've got to make the most of them. There are 600,000 young people coming out of full-time education this summer. We need to have a plan for all of them. All of them need to have a plan about their future prospects, and we mustn't leave anyone behind, given that youth long-term unemployment has risen in today's figures, for example. So I'm kind of optimistic, but we'll be keeping track of those ambitions. We won't be finishing, this kind of marks the final report of the Youth Commission, but it doesn't mark the end of the story. In many ways, it's the beginning, because we want to get those ideas out there. We want to test them. We want to work with people. We want to look at the areas that are really well on our Youth Opportunity Index and say, well, what are they particularly doing? What lessons can we learn from those? So we're very keen to work with anyone and everyone who wants to continue that partnership. And I guess just lastly, I should say a huge thanks to all of our panelists today, and to Fiona for doing an excellent job of chairing the discussions as well. Big thanks to all of our commissioners, as I mentioned at the start, who really guided this work, and to those sponsors and supporters who made it all happen. I hope that we've kind of shed some light on some ideas and some challenges and some opportunities. I hope that the report is a contribution to all of that, and I look forward to working with as many of you as possible on making sure that every young person gets a fair chance in life, which must be our aim, surely. So thank you all very much.